Welcome to the Dental School Guide podcast, your ultimate destination for all things dentistry. I'm Dr. Tanner Townsend, your guide through the complex world of dental education. Join us as we uncover the secrets of acing dental school admissions, navigating residency programs, and exploring career opportunities. Please share and enjoy. Real quick, just wanted to make all you pre-dental students out there aware of a resource. If you've ever been worried about getting into dental school or are wanting to get into that school of your dreams, then you definitely want to check out a program called Dental School Guide. In the program, we walk you through how to save money, time, and heartache when applying to dental school. There's so much fluff out there when it comes to resources for getting into school, and we are streamlining all of that. With our comprehensive digital course, expert mentorship, and personalized application review services, you'll have everything you need to stand out to admission committees. Take advantage of this amazing resource that will help you increase your chances of getting into dental school. You'll want to check out dentalschoolguide.com. Check it out. Welcome back to the Dental School Guide podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tanner Townsend, and today with us we have the Dean of Admissions at Marquette University, Mr. Brian Trecek. Brian, how are you doing today?
Tanner, I'm really good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We are super excited to have you on. So today, kind of the flow of how things are going to work is Brian's going to talk to us a lot about Marquette as a whole, and then we're going to really take a deep dive and kind of behind the curtains of what dental admissions are like at Marquette, but just kind of in general from Brian's vast experience. And then we're going to kind of close it out with some advice that he has to students that are applying or reapplying and so on. So Brian, tell us a little bit more about yourself. How long have you been at Marquette?
Yeah, Tanner, I knew you were going to start that way. I'm almost to the point of a little embarrassed sometimes. I'm one of the last of the Mohicans. I've been around dental education in Marquette for a very, very long time. I've been extremely fortunate, at least in the way I think a lot of admissions people think that I've been at one institution for a very, very long time. I'm finishing up my 28th year as director of admissions at the Dental School of Marquette. So I came to dental education in 1996. 12 years before that, I was at Marquette as an undergrad admissions guy. And I think that my experience, recruiting high school students and talking to parents was unbelievably valuable for me as I came into dental education. So a long, long time. I've been an admissions guy that's only one jersey. That doesn't happen usually for someone that's been around as long as I have, but the passage of time has been unbelievable. Seen a lot of good things happen at Marquette over that period of time. So it's not over yet. I'm still blinking and breathing, Tanner.
Heck yeah. Man, you're like the Derek Jeter of dental education admissions, man. Just been in the same spot. That's super cool. You really don't see that very much anymore, that you see admissions people jump around.
Part of it's because either people get itchy to go someplace else or probably more likely don't have the ability to have as much success as we had. I think sometimes that is something I'm proud of, that they've kept me around because we've been doing something pretty well and have been adaptable and been willing to change over those periods of time. So for me, it's been a blessing.
That is awesome. All right. Well, with that, let's jump in. You're the expert of Marquette and the whole admissions process. Tell us a little bit more about the School of Dentistry in general and what makes Marquette unique from all the other schools that are out there. What makes it so special and unique?
Yeah, Tanner, I think that's obviously an easy question, one to cover on the podcast, and a legitimate and a good question, and one that's difficult. It's at the probably heart of a lot of things that people go through as they're going through this process of deciding it. So sometimes maybe the ways in which I think people go can be different. The one thing I talk about all the time, and one of the main broad reasons that this podcast is important for me, is exposure. Marquette's a private dental school. Where we're located in the middle of the upper Midwest is really Big Ten territory. So I talk all the time about Cleveland, Ohio, east, Omaha, Nebraska, west, Twin Cities, Minneapolis, north, Oklahoma City, south. There's not a lot of private schools in that area. I always talk about 5 that come to mind. So the 3 Catholic Jesuit universities that are left that still have a dental school, Creighton in Omaha, Marquette in Milwaukee, Detroit Mercy in Detroit, Case Western in Cleveland is private. Downers Grove in Midwestern in Downers Grove, Illinois. So that's important to me. Marquette's a school that gets a lot of applications because people, I joke about this, Tanner, and people from California apply to Marquette. They don't even know how to say Marquette. They certainly
Yeah.
don't know how to spell it. They're not sure where Wisconsin is on a map, but they know one thing. They know that we take 50% of our class from out of state all the time. And so I think in the process of knowledge building as it relates to people watching this podcast, that's important to me. It doesn't matter where you live. Marquette's an equal opportunity lender for everybody. So that's the first thing that I would say. I mean, and then I guess I would say broadly, and we can probably talk about this a little bit longer. Marquette is a traditional university-based standalone dental schools. We're sort of one of the old guard, right? Marquette's been educating dentists for 135, 136 years. We've been around a long time. Marquette's, I think, reputation, our tradition. I hope the thing we never lose is we produce fire-breathing clinicians at Marquette. Marquette is a clinical dental school for a clinical profession. That doesn't mean that research doesn't happen, but we want to attract those people that got interested in patient care and want to get a handpiece in a patient's mouth as quickly in the curriculum as they possibly can. I think broadly that clearly is, for me, bullet point number one, without getting much more longer winded. The other thing I would mention as a second bullet point always is service and outreach. Those are built into the fabric of our school. That's not something that's new. Marquette is one of many dental schools where we are the only dental school in Wisconsin. So, Tanner, I joke all the time in presentations that Marquette's the best dental school in Wisconsin, and that's not a lie because we're the only dental school in
Yeah.
Wisconsin. But I think we've always recognized that we have a responsibility as we train and educate our students to use them as an engine of oral health care in parts of our state that are underserved. That's not new. I think it will always be a part of our school. And I think actually some of that externship, those community-based rotations in the D4 year, I think we're going to see some of that grow at Marquette in the near future.
Wow, that's a action-packed answer, my friend. So let's kind of dive into, you mentioned the two big things are getting students wet clinically as quick as possible. And I
Yeah.
think as someone coming into school, like when I was applying to dental school, that's what I wanted. Not like you said, not to say that the research isn't important and the other aspects in terms of like public health and like advocacy things aren't important, but that was a really important factor. How soon are you getting students wet
Yeah.
clinically with
Well,
their hands?
I think it's interesting too, Tanner. I think this idea of early clinic experience probably maybe held a little bit more water in the context of distinction 20 years ago than it does now.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea of those old sort of what I think we call blocked curriculums, right? You're in a tiered lecture hall for 2 years getting bombed with basic sciences before you ever see a patient. I mean, for us, I think we try to one of the things I think that's been interesting as well is I think integration is a big word in dental education today. This idea of blending what do you know is in relation to basic science and how that connects to what you do when you're doing treatment planning with the patient clinically. I think we're ahead of the curve. I think that we don't have National Board 1 and we don't have National Board 2 anymore. We have an integrated board. So I think dental education has gotten away from this idea of are you a research school or are you a clinical school? If you're a good school, you have to have both. But so I would say, I mean, students are exposed to patient care at Marquette during the D1 year. And Tanner, I mean, that doesn't mean that you're doing a root canal on Wednesday of your first week of
Yeah.
class. But I think that we want to get students out of that didactic lecture hall context as soon as we possibly can and blend in that simulation work and then getting into the clinic with patients as soon as we can. So I would say for our students, probably by the end of the second semester of their D1 year, they're being involved with clinics and with patients in a clinical context.
Well, that's great. Getting them in early and often is just huge. So you also had mentioned like the big thing with Marquette is expanding your outreach because you guys are the only school in Wisconsin. You're the very best school in Wisconsin. How does that externship work as a fourth year student? How are
Yeah,
you guys planning on expanding that? Because I think that's a
yeah,
huge thing that schools they say they want to get their students out, but how much are they really getting them out in the
yeah.
community?
Well, again, I think that Tanner, we've got like if you get on the Marquette website or look at our view books, we've always had 3 or 4 or 5 places in our state that we've worked with for a very, very long time. Tri County in Appleton, Chippewa Valley up in Eau Claire, Open Arms in Elkhorn. So I think that part of this is I think it's twofold. I think one of the things that's awesome. This gets a little long-winded. Hang with me. Marquette is a private and state related dental school. The reason that we have 50 spaces for out of state students every year in a class of 100 students, so it's a 50-50 split. Hang with me. So the kids in Wisconsin, I was like, you're the only dental school in the state, man. How come you only take 50% from in state? Well, part of it's because we're a private school, right? We don't have to take anybody from anywhere. But if we take everybody from Florida, we're not going to have any dentists in Wisconsin. So,
Yeah.
so that 50-50 split is about the fact that if a Wisconsin resident comes to Marquette, they get a subsidy from the state. So we're getting state money as a private dental school, which speaks to the impact that our dental school has on the overall quality of health in our state. It's incredibly important. And that's one of the reasons why, to maintain that political toehold, we want to make certain that the state recognizes how important Marquette is as they're educating their students. And so somebody from Wyoming or somebody from Salt Lake City that comes to Marquette and does an externship in their fourth year might end up staying in Wisconsin to practice through that sort of exposure. So I think we have a new dean at Marquette, and I think one of her main goals is to start to really sort of expand those places. It will not be difficult for her to find places that want to partner with our dental school, such that I don't know if this will exactly happen, but I think there could be a time where most of the D4 students are not in our building. They're out
Wow.
doing externships all the time. And Tanner, you know this, you went to dental school. When you're in school, you see one patient in the morning and one in the afternoon. You go up to Tri County in Appleton with 4 of your classmates, you might see 8, 9, or 10 patients a day, giving you a sense of, polishing your skills from an efficiency perspective outside the walls of educational dentistry and really getting a feel for what it's like when you're going to jump into practice. So that's some of the thing I think I would see, and I think that some of that work and that expansion is already happening right now.
Wow, that's excellent. I think just like you said, that is probably one of the most important things that I wasn't thinking about as much when I was applying to dental school. Like you hear like, oh, you have external rotations or whatever where you get outside the school and you're like, okay, that's 4 years away. Like I'm not worried about that. But when it really comes down to it, that's where like you really take the training wheels off
Yeah.
and you really see what you can do and what you're deficient in.
But
And just
Tanner,
having
it also speaks to making certain that those clinical skill sets in school start early, such that
yeah.
when those D4s are out there, they know what the hell they're doing, and
Uh-huh.
and they get exposed if they don't. So again, there will always be preceptors and faculty that are part of those external rotations, right? You're not completely on your own,
Yeah.
but it's giving you a much better feel for what life as a practicing dentist is really going to be like.
Yeah, totally. How often, like some schools are like, hey, you got 5 months total of rotations, or you've got like 3 days here, 3 days there. Roughly, what are your guys' goals of how you said most of the D4s outside the clinic on
Yeah.
rotations?
Well, I'm not
How,
sure we exactly know yet, but I would say right now, I mean, again, as it relates to sort of these external rotations right now are not something that's volunteer. It's built into the curriculum. You have to do
yeah,
it. If you said, would a student at Marquette right now be able to do all of the rotations at all of the sites? The answer is probably not. Could they, depending on where they're at with their, how close they are to finishing up clinical competencies, those sorts of things. But again, I would say I think that there's a goal such that the majority of those D4 students in that last year are going to be doing this stuff. So that's a lot of work, several months.
that's awesome. That is super great. All right. Well, what in terms of like clinical competencies and stuff like that, we don't have to get into all the nitty gritty because there are so many different competencies that you
Right.
kind of take. especially during your third and fourth year in the clinic. What are some of like the basic, like, hey, how many crowns do you need to do? How
Yeah.
many removable? How many fillings? So on and so
Yeah,
forth. What
Tanner,
are some?
we get those sorts of questions all the time, and I guess I would say, and I know that this podcast is going to go out to a lot of people, and I'm always conscious of like when you're talking to someone that's a non-dentist, you can say almost anything you want to. Nobody really knows if you
Yeah,
know what
no,
you're talking about or not.
yeah.
But so this is how I would answer your question. I guess I would say that there certainly are procedural sorts of things that you need to do to graduate from Marquette. I think this idea of, I think about when we tour a particular prospective candidate now, and their dad might be a dentist that graduated from dental school 30 years ago. And you get a lot of those questions from what that guy remembers from when he was in school 30 years ago. In a lot of
Yeah.
places, it's different. This idea of how many class two amalgams do I have to do? How many, for us, we sort of, have this group model where what we try to do is we're following a patient from birth to death, and it's a
Hmm.
little bit more interdisciplinary. If you don't have to do 11 of those before you can show competency in a certain proficiency, I don't think you necessarily have to do that. Everybody has to do bridges, everybody has to do crowns, everybody has to do those sorts of things, but I don't necessarily think that it's tied into a certain particular number that you have to do. I think it's a matter of making certain that you're showing competency in the context of treating a patient, holistically all the way through, not just giving them something that you need to do to cross a box off of your list. So a little bit less of the patient being a commodity by which you get your DDS, but using those patients in a context, much like people fall in love with dentistry because they see that the relationships that practicing dentists have with their patients, right?
Hmm.
Preventative dentistry, lifelong legacy, ability to see your patients. That's what sells dentistry in this profession. It doesn't happen very much anymore. So we try to mirror that relationship building through the clinical competency based at the school.
That's a great approach. Like taking it from, hey, we're just going to treat this person and get them done with their treatment. Because I think you see that at a lot of dental schools where they're not finishing treatment because they're just getting what the student needs to graduate. They're just getting
Right.
them out the door as soon as like, hey, I got my class two competency, I'm done. So that's a really great model to follow. In terms of like once you've prepared that D4 or D3 as they're kind of working their way towards graduation, what are some of the key things that you see that Marquette does really well to either prepare them for residency programs if they're seeking a residency program
Yeah.
or prepare them to find a job in private practice? What kind of
Yeah.
help and
Tara,
support does
good
Marquette
question.
offer?
I'd say, I guess, a couple of things. Try to start being a little bit more brief with some of my answers so we can get to all these. I mean, I think I've always said this. Maybe this is, all of us try to spin our answers in the way that sells our school in a certain way, right? But I've always told people, like at Marquette, probably 70%, 70, of the people that come to our school and graduate, they practice general dentistry. This might come up a little bit later, so I'll kill a couple birds with one stone. Four grad specialties at Marquette. We have ortho, endo, pros, and perio. And so if you rub off the edges, 70% of our students get in, I've said this for a long time. This might not really actually be a great thing to say. But I think competence and confidence are a huge thing, right? I
Totally.
always think about, somebody on a Friday sitting around Caffrey's at the end of a week talking to D3 buddies. You're like, you know what? I can't think of a time I've never been in school. You know what I think I'd like to do? I think I'd like to go to school for 6 more years. People make those decisions all the time. But one of the beauties of dentistry is you don't have to do that. 4 years, graduate, make an unbelievable contribution to wherever it is that you decide to practice as a general dentist. So, to get on point to your question, I think clinical competency is an awesome thing. It does two things. It either gives you the ability to feel like I can get out of here and I can open up somebody's mouth and I can make a difference right now.
Hmm.
Or having clinical skill sets also makes you an unbelievably attractive candidate for graduate specialties. A pediatric director of dentistry or perio or oral surgery they don't want to retrain their residents clinically before they get them into a place. So I think again that sort of very base idea of producing people that people know, military. Army, Navy. They love our applicants and our graduates because they know from a clinical perspective they're really, really strong. So I guess it's a double-edged sword, whether it's somebody that decides they want to go on for specialty training or they feel like they're ready to go and be a general dentist. I think that clinical skill set's the X factor.
No, it totally is. Being able to leave and be competent and know that you can do the dentistry that's presented before you. All right, well, let's kind of move into the dental admissions side of things and like take us behind the curtain a little bit about what you see and kind of what you're looking for. And this can be like admissions according to Brian Trecek and
Yeah.
also to Marquette
Yeah.
in some regards. But what, like, take us through like when you get applications, like what are you looking for when
Yeah.
someone's applying?
Yeah, Tanner, you'd sent up me a few things up front to think about. So I have to be respectful. And so remember, one of the things that's hard for me is I'm a one trick pony, right? I only know
Yeah.
I've never been at another dental school to know. I don't know how big other dental school staffs are. I'm certain that every dental admission person in the world would say they don't have enough staff to deal with what's going on. We have to be efficient with what we have. We have 3 people in my office, and I'm one of them, and I'm running around doing podcasts and recruiting my brains out all the time. So Tanner, I say this all the time, and I don't know if this will resonate with other directors that maybe with this idea of being in a mahogany office with a fireplace, smoking a pipe and being a gatekeeper. That's never how I've seen my job. I mean,
Yeah.
for Marquette, we got to hit the road and we got to recruit. But in the idea of sort of this idea of, you talked a little bit about, okay, you get these applications. We get a ton of apps, man. We had almost 2,800 apps at Marquette this year. So we're this little dinky place up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and there's people from all over the place that are applying. So my staff are the people that actually read and review applications. If you said, does every member of the admissions committee read every application? At Marquette, I can tell you that doesn't happen. And I would think that probably doesn't happen everywhere. Nobody would want to be on the admissions committee if they read
No,
all those files.
it's too
So
much.
I think the ability to that's where having a seasoned staff, I think, helps. There's nothing magic about reading an application and what it is you're looking for. It's a process where it's a grind, man. You gotta roll up your sleeves and you gotta pray to God that of these people that you identify and move down this funnel to the interview stage, there's tons of really good people. I don't know if you ever think about this, but when you were in school and some days you have a rough day, I'm like, are you kidding me, man? There's people that would cut you their leg off to be in your chair. I talk about that to our students all the time. So I guess to maybe get on point, and maybe it helps sometimes that I'm not that bright. I think the process of what makes a good candidate are pretty simple. There's not that many variables. I think we've lost this a little bit, Tanner, and I guess this would be a point of emphasis for me on this podcast, particularly since the pandemic. We all talk about holistic review, right? You are
Hmm.
more than a GPA and a DAT score. That's true, but that doesn't mean that grades and DAT scores don't matter, right? When
Yeah.
we're in an academic endeavor, when you're trying to identify somebody who's best or good, that matters, right? So I still think transcript is king. Where did you go to school? What courses did you take? How many courses did you take? How tough were they? And what was your trend of performance? I don't talk so much about cumulative GPA anymore because a cumulative GPA is a product of semesters of work, right? Sometimes quarters. But if somebody has a weak freshman year, that doesn't necessarily mean they're toast, right? What did you do sophomore and junior year? The advent of gap years, people waiting longer than just applying in between junior and senior. So I guess I would say this. I think academic background, grades, DAT scores, they are married. That's why Kaplan is $1 billion industry. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people that don't have very good grades. So they figure, I got to jack up my DAT, man. I'm going to spend a lot of money on Kaplan to do that. I think the categories of this idea of orientation to dentistry. What do you know about dentistry? How do you know it? And how do you articulate that to the committee? To me, that's a variable that gives committees sometimes courage to look at somebody that maybe on paper isn't good as somebody else that doesn't have that same sort of passion. That's not to me tied into how many hours of shadowing did you do. There's a bunch of people that do 600 hours of shadowing that haven't learned anything more than someone that's done 60. And then I would say for us, balance, extracurriculars, leadership, Service. What have you done to take emphasis off of yourself? Put it on somebody else. We live in a selfish world. I would like to have graduates from Marquette not be selfish as it relates to being the kinds of people that we want in healthcare. So your snowball needs to be big. I talk about, people say, what's the most important thing? My answer to that always is, the most important thing is that you do a lot of stuff well, not just one thing's well. That's what helps you get moved down the funnel. So that would be some of my thoughts.
That's great. Not being a one trick pony. Yeah, I think that's a huge thing. So, in terms of volunteering, there's so many different aspects that students need to perform well in to move down that funnel. Out of those, do you feel like the volunteering aspect of outside the academic is probably the most important thing to
Yeah,
you?
I think for us, it probably is one of the most important. And, I joke all the time, like some people call and they'll be like, hey, Brian, should I do a mission trip? And I'm sort of
Yeah.
like, I'm not so sure how to answer that. Like, am I supposed to go, nah, that's a kind of a waste of your time. But I think that I want people to do those sorts of things, not because it gives them a smiley face next to their application, but because they want to do it. It gives us it's sort of like when schools talk about, if you're getting paid to do this, it's not as important if you're not getting paid. I think the experience in any way becomes important. But yes, so for us, and I'm not, Tanner, another thing I would say is I'm not a big proponent of like somebody that has one of those accordion things that come down and like, look, I participated in 55 things.
Yeah.
I would rather you take maybe a more of a meaningful or leadership role in fewer things than just being engaged in a bunch of stuff. But again, I think that gives us an idea of balance, right? Not just somebody that's staying in a study, Carol, trying to jack up their grades and DAT scores without being involved in any other way. You're a dentist. You know that some of the things that make you different or elite over just being adequate is not how smart you are. It's the soft things. We talk about the soft things that actually aren't soft at all. They're a big deal. How do you treat your staff? How do you treat your patients? Those sorts of skill sets. Sometimes the best dentists are not the people that graduate in the top 5% of their class, right?
Hmm.
It's the people that ground it out and had a few obstacles, were able to handle critique, and know how to deal with people. That's, I think, when we will talk about interviewing, maybe that's the most important thing to me about interviewing, not a right or wrong answer, but trying to get a sense of how you think and what's the philosophy of how you answer some of those questions.
Oh, that's great. In terms of the application itself, can you kind of sense those soft skills through their writing in a sense? Does
Yeah,
that kind
I
of
mean,
help
I
move
think you
it?
can. I tell people all the time, Tanner, that I think it's fairly, it's pretty universal. That if you ask a dental applicant, what's the toughest part of the application, they all say the personal statement,
Yeah.
and because that's, everything else is kind of just data driven stuff. Um, so yeah, I've chaired the admissions committee at Marquette for a long time. And I don't know if I should actually say this. I say it all the time, so I might as well say it on the podcast. I don't know that we've ever denied somebody at Marquette because of a poor quality of their personal statement. Personal statement is the way in which you introduce yourself to the committee. I don't think that there's a magic framework to do that, right? I always tell that people that I think it helps if there's a beginning and a middle and an end. I
Yeah.
think it helps if it's well written, and I'm a storyteller. So those ideas of, why do I want to be a dentist, or how do I know I want to be a dentist? Somewhere in the answers to those questions, to me, are a good personal statement. I'm not crazy about people showing their personal statement to 9 other people, getting their input and rewriting. Pretty soon, it's not yours anymore.
Hmm.
But I think, to go back to your question, I think, yes, I think to the degree that somebody doesn't just mail in their application and you can tell they take some time on it, I think that makes a difference for sure.
That's awesome. Now, going back to the grades for a minute, some people don't have the best grades in terms of getting to school or whether it's stat score or something like that. Is there a cutoff that you feel like you have
Yeah. I'm
that
always,
you're like, well, this one's out?
we get that question a lot, and I guess I would honestly say that I would say we do not have a cutoff at Marquette. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have a 2.4 GPA you're going to get accepted, but
Hmm.
and so we all talk about profiles, and we all talk about sort of that all those sorts of things. But I would say, as we review an application, There's very rarely a time where we look at an application, see it, and throw it in a denial category. And Tanner, I would say this for purposes of the podcast because I've been saying it for a long time. On Doctor Student Network, or whatever it's called, we all have streams, and I'm guilty of a
Yeah.
lot of stuff on that thing. If you think directors of admission don't read that thing, I can tell you you're wrong. We usually do it while we're drinking some Irish whiskey or something, but we hold files at Marquette for a long time. We don't do that to drive people crazy or create false hope. We're just not a school we're a private school. I don't have an ego about the fact that everybody we admit is going to come. And I don't want
Yeah.
to get to March and have 12 spaces left to fill and I don't have anybody to look at because I denied everybody in December and January. So ultimately, everybody that applies to our school has closure to their file. You will not be a person that applies to Marquette and say, I applied to Marquette and I never heard anything. We make it our business to make certain that people ultimately know one way or the other. So we don't really, people have a pretty good sense of, where our box is, but I would say it would not be accurate to say that we have a cutoff.
Gotcha. And in terms of like post-backs and master programs, there are certain students that say, hey, I'm just going to take, I know my DAT score is kind of where I need it to be. My grades, not quite where I needed to be. How do you guys view those and decipher
Yeah.
those? Because they're they vary so much
Yeah.
in
Tanner,
terms
good
of like the
question.
difficulty and stuff
And
like that.
I guess I have some relatively strong feelings about that, and I think that I recognize all of the time, um, you know, some of the questions, and I want to talk about this. You can get a little bit later about, do you want people to call your school, or are you a school that says,
Yeah.
don't bother us? We don't want anybody, I think that it's to a school's detriment if they have that kind of a sense of thing. We got to recruit, man. I want
Hmm.
people to come to Marquette sometimes. And if you said, how come you pick Marquette? It would be because I didn't have the heart to say no to those guys. They worked too hard to get me to come. That's
Hmm.
not probably always the most substantive sort of thing. you know, Post baccalaureate programs, in my mind, became a gigantic cottage industry with the advent of gap years, and
Yeah.
everybody at Marquette thinks that I have this reputation. Like, Brian, I hear you hate gap years. I don't hate gap years. I just don't necessarily think that they're a panacea. I think everyone that does one thinks that they're all going to get admitted at the end of the gap year. And the other thing that I've learned that is not fair is that everybody that does a gap year doesn't necessarily do it because they think their academic background isn't strong enough and they need to improve it. If that is the reason you're doing a gap year, then the idea is, what the hell did you do during your gap year to fix your grades, right?
Yeah.
Getting a job in an oral surgery office doesn't fix your weak science GPA. So I'm actually a proponent of post backs. I like them a lot better than someone that says, I'm going to take 2 classes online this summer and get A's, and now all of a sudden I'm all better, right?
Yeah.
Some schools have post backs that guarantee more than others. We actually have a post back program at Marquette. And the only thing it guarantees is that if you're in it, we will interview you in the fall at our dental school. But if you perform poorly in the post back program, it's not necessarily going to help you, right?
Hmm.
So to get to your point, and this is something that all of us in the dental admission office struggle with, there's a ton of people that don't get admitted to dental school, not because of what they're doing now, but because what they didn't do 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And how do we continue to hold that against those people, right? And so to me, if you have a week, 130 credits of undergraduate work and do a post back, the post back is the most recent work, but that doesn't mean that we forget about what's not good, right? That's like if a person did poorly freshman and sophomore year, awesome junior, and they say, just look at my junior year. It doesn't
Hmm.
work that way. It's a combination of all of that work. That's what makes it tricky when we have a lot of applicants that are awesome in the entirety of their undergraduate work against a person that's doing a post back. I would say by definition, that means someone's got a bruise, right? They're doing the post back for some reason. So, do post baccalaureate people ever get into Marquette? Yes. Do reapplicants ever get into Marquette? Yes. But they don't get in just because they've showed stick to itiveness and they've reapplied. It's, what did you bring to the dance this time that you didn't bring last time? And is it substantive enough to make up the gap? That's the critical piece. So it's
Hmm.
always the combination of the total body of your academic work, both good and bad.
No, that's great. How do you guys do it? Because a lot of those post backs, let's say, like, for example, you're starting a post back this April or May. and the application opens in June or July.
Yeah, it's
Like, how the
crazy.
heck do you like, it's
Well,
crazy because it's like, how do you judge
yeah.
that? Because there's no
Well, I mean, that's
track
how it is
record.
for everybody. Yeah, timing becomes a huge issue. We're dealing with that at this time. This is not my favorite time of the year as a director of admissions. I don't even know who's coming into the school. I don't deal with them. I'm dealing with all the people that are trying to, have us give them the magic answers of what to do to get in next year. And so, yeah, when you get denied in February, and then all of a sudden you're going to reapply February, March, April. It's 3 months before June when you start reapplying again, right? Brian, what do I do to make myself a better candidate? Well, whatever you're doing in the fall, we're probably not going to know the answers to that until after our offers of admission for the next cycle in mid-December go out. So that's the hard part. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes people reapply 2 and 3 times before they get in. Sometimes this idea of taking your foot off the accelerator and using that next academic year not to reapply, but to bring something very, very substantive to the process for, in this world, the 25-26 cycle, which sounds like a million years away. It's not. That's the one tough part about dental school, right? You can't start in the spring. You got to start in the fall. And if you don't start in the
Mhm.
fall, you got to wait another cycle to get back. So that's the balance. This idea of, am I going to throw my chips in the table and wait and see what happens right away, or am I going to fall back and take this next year to try to really improve? Part of that comes down to being able to pick up the phone and talk to schools, hope that somebody answers the telephone, and give you good advice. I always tell applicants that I don't tell them what to do. I paint a picture and I let them make the decision what it is they want to do. We're directors of admission. They pay us to get people to apply, but
Mhm.
I want to make sure people apply at the time where they feel like they're the best applicant, whether that's in a traditional box or later, or if they're 22 years old or 34 years old, doesn't really matter.
I think that's great. I think a lot of students, you see them rush when they didn't get in. They're like, okay, I got to do something to get in next year. So that's where like the planning comes in. You know, if you're a good applicant or a
Yeah,
strong applicant or not. If by like October, November, you're not feeling very confident, you haven't gotten any interviews or something like that, you need to start planning ahead of time
I agree.
to how you're going to change your applicant, because we see so many students get to this point where it's like March and they're like, shoot, I didn't get in, or I haven't heard anything yet, or I'm waiting on a prayer on this one waitlist school. It's too late. And
Yeah.
there's not
And
much you
that's,
can add.
yeah, again, this is also the time of the year where maybe it's a little bit different between being a state school and a private school. So we got 50 people that have paid a deposit to come to Marquette. I have no idea how many of those people are waiting and begging and calling their in-state state school every day to say, did a space
Can I
open
come
up?
instead?
That's what we have alternate pools for, man, right? I tell people I don't want this to be the case, but there are probably hundreds of people on alternate lists right now in April that are going to be in dental school in August. They just don't know it yet. And it,
Hmm.
it, it was kind of a quiet, I feel like a little bit like those guys that are pitching a no hitter and then you don't want to talk to them in the dugout. Things
Yeah.
have been pretty good. So I don't like to talk about it too much, but it was a pretty quiet March for Marquette. And that's good. We're hanging on to people, which is good.
Oh, that is excellent. As Marquette does that. So here's a question in relation to, okay, that student, hey, they're not applying this year. They're gonna take that post back or do a master's program. Some of those classes, I know traditionally they've been like, oh, you have to wait. If you have classes that are older than 5 years that are required classes, those don't count anymore. You have to retake them. What is Marquette's opinion on that?
Well, I guess I would say that typically for, again, those non-negotiables, particularly science, bio, chem, OChem, physics, biochem, we want
Mhm.
that to be inside a 5-year timeline. Um, and I don't find that to be that we have a problem with that very, very often. But if there's someone that's a career changer, they're coming back and they're applying to dental school in their late 30s and they haven't taken biology for 15 years, we want
That's a
them to take it
problem.
over again. Yeah. That doesn't happen a lot. We just want that information to be fresh in their minds, right? If they're going to take the DAT, that's the material on it. And I guess you could probably teach yourself to do okay in those areas, but I think having that coursework be fresher than old is going to help them in dental school as well.
Totally. All right. So going back to the admissions process, do you guys have like a ranking system where you'll rank those students that you want to invite to an interview? how does that process kind of come
Yeah, we
about of
don't
who you get
rank.
to
Yeah,
interview?
and that really rank mostly comes up, Tanner, when it comes to alternate lists.
Mm,
I've seen that on blogs sometimes. Like the guy at Marquette says he doesn't rank things, but I know that he does. I'm telling you, man, we don't rank things. We want to give the committee flexibility to pick anybody they want to. And if you were ranked, the only people that would care are my number one, right? You're number
yeah.
one out of 63 people. If you're number 13, then everyone's like, okay, well, do you take 13 people? Do you not? So that's where it gets a little bit crazy. But yeah, I don't think that we have sort of this idea of what you would think of when we rank. And I can tell you too that, and this may come up, Tanner, a little bit. I'll mention it while we're talking about. So since the pandemic, Marquette's gone to virtual interviews. I'm an old guy. Sometimes I'm still like one of those guys whittling on a porch talking about how awesome things were 40 years ago. We interviewed people from almost 40 states this year.
Wow.
So there's legitimate reasons to stay virtual, but you're not going to talk to any admissions people at any schools that don't want people to come to their buildings and see them. That's how you learn the culture of the school.
Hmm.
So we're all doing visit days and all those sorts of things. But I think one of the things that's happened with virtual interviewing, I think this is probably something you'll hear across the country, is applications to schools are increasing because people don't have as much skin in the game anymore. So what we've got to be careful about is apps go up. It's cool to say our applications are up, but what's your yield? What percentage of the people you're admitting are you actually getting? And that to me, that's always been the critical piece, right? We
Hmm.
we want to make certain that if we're going to get somebody from Utah to come, it's not just because they didn't get into Utah or Roseman. We want them to come to Marquette, even if they got accepted to their in-state schools. That's where it becomes a little bit more difficult. But I would say this idea of a ranking system that's pretty foreign to us. We don't do that at Marquette.
That's great. And I think, like you said, the virtual interviews are great. You can definitely interview a lot more students and kind of get a better feel. But it is a double edged sword in the fact that you don't get as much of a feel for the applicant sometimes, and just like that, they don't get as much of a feel for the school at the same time. So I think there is something to be said for virtual, but there is definitely something to be said for going, whether it's a open house day or an interview
Yeah,
or whatever the case may be, of seeing the school in person of what it's
yeah,
like.
no doubt. And I think some schools, I would like to believe us. I mean, and remember, Tanner, I joke about this all the time that when you're an admissions guy, like very rarely do we hear something from somebody that go like, I applied to 15 schools and my experience with you was the absolute worst experience. These people are trying to get into school, right? So we get
Hmm.
a lot of smoke blown up our skirts sometimes, I think, even, but I think to the degree, and we've talked about this a lot, when you go virtual, that doesn't mean that you can't be personal. It doesn't. You've got to try really hard to try to reflect your culture when you're doing virtual interviews. So the technology is awesome. It's like witchcraft to me, like this thing we're doing.
Yeah,
I don't even know how it works. It's just cool that it does. But ultimately, if you're coming halfway across the country for school, you want to be able to come and see it and get a feel for that. So we've got the ability for you to do that as well.
that's great. All right, so we've kind of talked a little bit about interviews already, of how you've kind of gone virtual. How do you guys format those virtual
Yeah.
interviews? What's your
Yeah.
structure?
Everybody's got even different definitions for certain things. Multiple mini interviews that were very common for a long time. Marquette is not a school that does Curie or Casper. I guess maybe, Tanner, we're a little bit old school in that context, in that I just always feel like we just want to talk to you and try to have a conversational interview. So with our virtual interviews, a candidate, what we do is, it's kind of interesting and weird when it started, but it's worked out for us very successfully. We do a 2-day interview now. So on the day that you interview, we typically interview Fridays and Mondays. So if you're interviewing on a Friday or a Monday, we do a pre-interview day on Thursday. And all it is an informational day where we do our presentations and we recruit you, and we do a student panel. The student panel is probably the most informative part of those pre-interview days, such that then when you interview, all of the questions that you had are over with. All you have to do is focus on the interview itself. We do a 2-person interview. So we have, at Marquette, we have 14 people on our admissions committee. And our committee is made up of both full-time and part-time faculty. We have 2 D4 students that are on our committee. And then we have sometimes recent graduates, Marquette grads that have been out of school for a few years and want to give back by being on the committee. And when you interview, you'll interview with 2 of those people, 15 minutes each. So a 30-minute interview, little break in between. That's it, done. So we do probably, well, not probably, in the fall of the year, Tanner, we do 12 interview days. We usually start 3rd week in September, go till the end of October, Fridays and Mondays. Those are all non-residents. And then Wisconsin residents interview in November, 3 days in November. Typically, we do 2 non-resident interview days in January, and then we're done. So we do typically about 14 interview days, 32 people a day. So we do about 480 interviews on a base of about 26 to 2,700 apps.
Wow. That's a lot. That's a lot of interviews.
Yeah, and then some guys on an interview day will raise their orange hand and they'll say, "Are you going to accept everybody that you interview?" And I was like, I go to the chapel on campus at Marquette and pray to God that we don't have to make 480 offers to get 100 people to say yes. This year, I think we've been around 175, 180 offers to fill the class, which is interesting. So semantics. Hey, Brian, I hear you admit 100 students. We enroll 100 students. We're never going to have 100% yield, taking 50% of our people from out of state. But, if we run a 55, 56, 57% yield on our offers of admission, that's pretty successful for us.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a standard kind of across the board that you can kind of expect from a school. In
Yeah.
terms of the selection process, are you guys meeting after every single interview day, all
Yeah,
sitting
it's
in
a
a
good
room
question.
together?
We do
Or
not do that.
what do you guys
And
do?
that comes up. It's funny, as long as I've been doing this, sometimes you get questions that become, I don't know if people read them and say that you're supposed to ask that sort of stuff, but we don't, when we do what happens, I always talk to students like I interview you and I go, man, this
Mhm.
Tanner guy, he's fantastic. And then I interview the next guy and I go, I thought Tanner was good. This guy's really good. And
Mhm.
so I think that for us, we don't do any decision making until all of the interviews are done. So sometimes when people are like, I feel like I'm interviewing too late in the process, Brian, all the spaces are going to be filled. I'm like, it doesn't
No.
matter. So we do all of the out of state interviews, then make decisions, then interview in-staters and make the decisions. So that's also interesting for you to think about and for the podcast. These decisions, I guess maybe some schools, maybe med schools, at the end of an interview day, decide which people of the people that they interviewed that day are they going to select.
Yeah.
We don't do that. We sort of wait till the N is done. So we've seen as many people as we can and then make the poll. So we do a scoring rubric when we interview. And so I've told people this. I don't know that this will ever happen. The greatest YouTube thing of all time would be for students to watch a selection meeting to see what actually happens after interviews and to see the fighting and the kibitzing that goes on between committee members to make choices. If they think that's easy, they should do it sometime. It is not easy. And
Yeah.
that's why we have multiple people look at one applicant, right? Cream rises to the top, garbage falls to the bottom. That's pretty easy. Sometimes in the middle, there's a lot of discussion that happens. And these applicants deserve to have that kind of discussion go on as it relates to choices.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. How long are those meetings lasting sometimes?
They can be long, man. 8-hour days
Oh,
sometimes in terms of making that happen. And if we need longer to do that, we'll do that. That's part of, I think, one of the things that is important for me. We try to do a lot of preparation before those selection meetings to have as much information for the committee members as we possibly can. But one of the cool things, again, to go back to your questions about interviewing, at our school, when you interview, you're not meeting with an interviewer. You're meeting with a member of the committee that's going to be a voting member on you. So that matters. We don't do blind interviews. The people who interview at Marquette have read your file before. And so I always talk to people like, if you're a good candidate, you want somebody to have read your file before they
Oh
interview you.
yeah.
If you're not so good, so it's never totally blind, right? There's somebody that's vetted a file to decide whether you're going to interview them or not. The interviewer is not necessarily always someone that's looked at the file, so they're not biased about whether they know if the person's good or not. But for us, we want to have the committee member know a little bit about them before we interview them.
So here's a little in deeper question with that selection day or that selection process. I can't imagine everyone's had the time to read every application. So do you guys present the stats, and do those interviewers present on the person and kind of give a general sense? How does that work?
It's exactly how it works. We prepare a PowerPoint. So we say, here's the person's picture. Here's where they went to school. Here's the salient information. So that's the one thing that's interesting. Like people always say like, okay, so I'm interviewing now. I'm on the same level as everybody else. Well, that's not
Mhm.
always true, right? There's a variance in people's metrics relative. Someone's maybe applied 3 years in a row. Someone's a brand new applicant. Someone's got new scores. Someone's at different, like that whole thing about like, Brian, do you know how good my school is? Do you know how good my grades would be if I was at school X? That stuff happens all the time. That's one of the awesome things about being here for a long time is we've built, recruitment pipelines into a lot of places. We know what's good and we know what's not good. We know how
Mhm.
deep we can go and how deeply we can't go. And so there's wiggle room to that, right? It's like you have a draft board, but you also have to, we build a class, right? So it's sort of like, that doesn't necessarily sound really good, but we got 3,000 people, man, but we're not going to interview 100 people from California and 100 people from Florida because we're probably not going to get those people to come. um, I'm very, very conscious as we make decisions on who we interview to be inclusive to the country geographically. I want people from the East. I want people from the West. I want people from the Midwest, and I want people from the South. But we also, but we're going to be heavily loaded more in the Midwest than we are in those other areas. We've got people typically between 15 and 20 states represented in our D1 class every year. It doesn't have to be that way, right? Not everybody has to be from Chicago, but we're going to have a little bit better luck getting people from Michigan and Ohio and Minnesota than we are people from New York and from Texas and from California. But we like to have some of those people too.
That's great. All right. Well, we're going to wrap up with some just general advice that you have for students.
Good.
And one final thing that we wanted to discuss in terms of that, you always hear this adage on all those forums like Student Doctor Network, Reddit, oh, get your application in early. Like you want to get it in first thing in June. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah.
Is there like, hey, if this person's got this in by mid-August, they're considered early? Or
Yeah.
how do you guys view that as a
Yeah,
committee?
Tanner, that's a good question. And a question that I think would probably be answered a little differently school by school relative to where they are and if they're a state or a private school. So I always answer that question in that, and I'm not sure this it makes you happy, but timing is a huge issue to me.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
as a director of admission, I can tell you that it is brutal to talk to applicants who metrically are phenomenal candidates that screwed themselves in the process because they waited to apply too long. So I'm not suggesting early, but prompt, being conscious of timing matters. People say to me all the time, are you telling me you'd invite somebody for an interviewer that's not as good as me because they applied on time? And my answer is yeah. And twice on Sunday, because we have really good applicants that applied on time too. That's all tied into DAT. When do you take it? Do you have to retake it? All that stuff. So I always tell people that and I think that people know this, but it's good to remind them. You're not applying to the schools. You're going to send your app out to the ADIA in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing I can do to call them and say, can you speed up this guy's application? They're out of their mind. They're processing 16,000 applications. So I tell people that apply to Marquette all the time, submit your AdSAS app in the first 15 days of June. There's a difference between the 2nd of June and the 11th of June? No. It just gives us more time to process it. And you don't want to, these guys have to learn their emergency is not everybody else's emergency, right? So if you're like, well,
Mm-hmm.
you need to do this tomorrow, sorry, man, it doesn't always work that way. So always tell applicants, AdSAS will process your application, whether you've taken the DAT by that time or not. Brian, I'm taking my DAT at the end of July. Is that okay? Well, I would rather you take it sooner, but if you wait till July and nail it, that's good. Just don't wait till that time to send your application in. So, Tanner, for us at Marquette, our interview invitations for the fall go out the week of Labor Day, early September. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't do them on a rolling basis. So 384 invites go out on a blast. And so I always use this example. It's not a great one. Let's say you're the valedictorian at Duke and you have a 28 on the DAT, but I don't have your application until the middle of September. You're not going to get a fall interview because all the slots are already filled.
Mm-hmm.
So I think timing does matter. It's one of the reasons we do interviews in January, because there's really, really good applicants. The reason we're interviewing them in January rather than September is we didn't have their applications sometimes until the middle of October. And
Yeah.
then they got to pray that there's spaces available in the class January, February, March, because we're always trying to do everything we can to get that class filled as quickly as we can.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, any parting words of advice that you have for students that are applying to Marquette, but anywhere? What
Yeah,
what advice do you have for those students?
I guess I would say, and maybe, you know, there's a million people that want to be physicians and dentists in this world that don't ever do what you have to do it. So to get into the application, like sometimes on those posts, it drives me crazy. Or someone says it doesn't matter if you interview, everybody interviews. That's nonsense. That is not true.
Mm-hmm.
To get vetted into this process is awesome. So I guess the thing that I would say is it helps to be smart. It helps to have done a little research and know why and what schools you're applying to. Be as good as you can on a broad base. Be smart, be good test takers, know this is what you want to do. And then the other thing I would say, and Tanner, this didn't come up, and then I'll shut up. One of the things that I think is becoming much more apparent since the pandemic that I want dental applicants to think of, certainly at Marquette, like what's the most important characteristic you have to be successful in dental school? Being smart helps, but you went through dental school. The toughest day of dental school, you didn't fall back on how big your brain was. You got to be
Mm-hmm.
tough. You have to be resilient. You have to be able to handle critique. You have to be willing to raise your hand every once in a while and say, I need a lifeline, man. I'm lost. And
Mm-hmm.
and when you're a superstar, it's humbling to do that. But if you do that and you are a collaborative spirit, it's going to make dental school be a lot better. So those are some of the things that I would say. It helps to be smart, but it also helps to remain humble and hungry and know that there's people out there that are willing to help you. Faculty love that. They hate arrogance. Don't be that way. So there's some parting thoughts for you.
Gosh, I love it. That is great. All right. Well, we'll end with that today. But Brian, thank you so much once again for coming on the podcast today, and we will catch you next time.
Great. Tanner, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And keep Marquette in mind, guys. Thanks, Tanner. I'll be in touch.
Okay, we'll do.
Have a good day.
Brian. That's all for today's episode of the Dental School Guide podcast. We hope you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your journey into dentistry. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more expert advice, inside tips, and engaging discussions. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review. It would mean the world to us. Until next time, keep smiling, keep striving, and remember, your dental dreams are closer than you think. Thanks for tuning in to the Dental School Guide podcast.